He couldn't name it not at first. It wasn't the way she walked, though her steps held a rhythm that felt older than time. It wasn't her eyes either, though when they met his, he felt something twist, as if she'd seen something in him even. He had forgotten. No, it was something else, something quieter, slower. Like a scent he couldn't place, but that reminded him of home and fire and danger all at once. She didn't speak much that first evening, and it unnerved him more than any rejection might have. She simply existed, unbothered, unwaiting, uninterested in explaining herself. And in a world that demanded women to perform softness, to offer pieces of themselves like samples on a platter, she withheld. Not coldly, but completely. Carl Jung once wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. She didn't try to transform him. That was the part that shook him. She simply let him react to her, and react he did. He began to mirror her silence without meaning to. He'd reach for his phone, draft a message, then erase it. Not because he feared rejection. He had known that before, but because he feared disruption. There was something sacred about her detachment, and to break it felt like interrupting. A ritual in a language he hadn't learned yet. He asked around about her, learned fragments she had lived in 2 countries, practiced meditation daily, refused to date casually, and always left parties early. Someone said she was too into herself. But the way it was spoken, laced with bitterness, made it sound more like a wound than a warning. Others said she was mysterious, hard to read, aloof. But none of it explained the pull. Why did he, a man who had always preferred women who adored him openly, find himself drawn to one who barely noticed his presence? Why did he feel like he was the one being studied, as if his own soul were the subject of a silent assessment? It started subtly, the unraveling. He began questioning things he'd never questioned. Why he filled silences with words. Why he sent messages at midnight, hoping for attention. Why the idea of being ignored by her stung more than being rejected by others. Her silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like invitation. An invitation inward. And that terrified him. He realized that much of what he had thought was desire in his past was actually just hunger for validation, for control, for the comfort of being needed. But she needed nothing. And because of that, he started to crave her need. She wasn't performing mystery. She was mystery. There was no coyness in her, no games. Her eyes didn't flirt. They observed. Her hands didn't reach for him. They rested in stillness. And yet he felt touched in places he didn't know were touchable by presence alone. It reminded him of childhood moments when he'd stare at a candle and forget to blink. Not out of fascination with the flame, but because it gave him something wordless to feel. She was like that, something wordless, something ancient, something that pulled. He started noticing things. The way her energy shifted when someone entered the room. The way she never responded instantly, not out of rudeness, but intention. The way she listened, not to reply, but to witness. Conversations. With her felt like confessionals, even when she said nothing. There was no chase in her, but there was still tension, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no wind. You knew something could happen, but you didn't know when. Or why. Or what would trigger the fall. Carl Jung often spoke about the anima of the feminine. Image in a man's unconscious mind. How a man's relationship to women mirrored his relationship to his own soul. This was no ordinary attraction. This was archetypal. She wasn't just a woman to him. She was the doorway to everything he had denied in himself. Softness, intuition, longing, surrender, and it unsettled him. Because now he had to choose stay in the safety of ego, where relationships were just mirrors for his pride, or descend into the unknown, where she waited without waiting, watched without wanting, and pulled without touching. He dreamed of her, not in romantic scenes, but in symbols. Once she appeared as a woman with water flowing from her hands, soaking the ground wherever she walked. Another time she stood on a staircase made of clouds, looking down at him with no judgment, just knowing. In waking life, her presence was scarce, but in sleep, she ruled. He started journaling again, not because she asked, but because he needed a way to handle the parts of him she'd awoken. The boy who feared abandonment. The man who feared losing control. The shadow self who hated being invisible. There was no clear beginning with her. No moment of confession, no exchange of numbers, no flirtatious teasing. But there was a current. Like something spiritual had cracked open the second he looked too long at her and found himself reflected not as a man, but as a boy waiting to be seen by something sacred. Her silence had weight. Her absence had presence. And he began to suspect that what pulled him wasn't even hurt, was what she represented. The feminine unknown. The divine not yet understood. The magnetic wound. Men are not used to wounds. They cannot fix, especially the emotional kind. So he tried, at first, to define her. Maybe she was emotionally unavailable. Maybe she had trauma. Maybe she was just playing hard to get. But none of it stuck, because she didn't deny him. She just didn't pursue him. And that difference, so small on the surface, broke something open in him. He realized how much of his masculinity had been built on being wanted, on being needed, on being the center of a woman's orbit. But she didn't orbit him. She existed in her own sky. And he had to decide whether to rise or retreat. Whether to meet her in stillness or walk away in confusion. Either way, she wouldn't move. And that, in itself, was the most seductive thing he had ever known. Asterisk, he first saw her in the way a man senses a storm, long before the skies turn. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dressed in anything designed to capture attention. And yet, something in her presence awakened a hunger he didn't even know he had. She didn't speak often, but when she did, her voice held the kind of gravity that made the room lean toward her. She was soft-spoken, but never small, gentle, but never weak. The air around her felt like it had chosen silence on purpose, as if her stillness was a deliberate rebellion against the noise of the world. Men don't fall for women like this because of beauty. They fall because they sense that this woman carries something they lost long ago, something buried deep within their unconscious. Carl Jung might say, this is the anima in full bloom, the feminine principle that dances in a man's psyche, not as a lover, but as a mirror. When he sees her, it's not just a Zirit's memory. He's remembering the nurturing he missed, the gentleness he never received, the maternal presence his ego rejected. And worse, he sees the cost of every woman he ignored who held this kind of still power. He doesn't approach her easily. He lingers, watches, makes small movements toward her, but recoils just as quickly. His ego pretends indifference, but his shadow is already kneeling. He starts doing irrational things, showing up where she might be, listening when she speaks to others, replaying small interactions in his mind like sacred rituals. He becomes addicted not to her presence, but to her mystery. She doesn't reveal herself in one gaze. She doesn't need to post loud declarations of her worth. She is the kind of woman who disappears in the middle of a sentence and makes you desperate to find the ending. Men like him don't fall in love in a straight line. They spiral. They orbit her like a moon trapped by invisible gravity. He finds himself pulling away just to feel the pain of being without her, only to return and pretend he never left. His masculine pride wrestles with his wounded boy, the part of him that knows she could undo him with just one truth. And yet, he doesn't run, because part of him knows this is the work he avoided his entire life. And she doesn't try to heal him. That's the secret. She doesn't nurture the wound. She lets him see it. One evening, after a conversation that felt more like a shared breath than an exchange of words, he walks away disturbed. She had said something small, something seemingly unimportant, but it pierced him. She mentioned how some men confuse possession with intimacy, how real love doesn't conquer, surrenders. He smiles at her words in the moment, but later. That night, he sits alone and feels something unravel. The women he's pursued before, the ones he thought he loved, were never seen as equals. They were mirrors for his ego, not his soul. And now this woman, this quiet storm, this keeper of her own silence, she doesn't fight for him. She doesn't chase. She doesn't flinch. Her absence feels louder than most people's presence. And that's what wounds him most. She's the one woman he can't dominate, can't define, can't distract himself from. She makes him look at himself, and what he sees isn't flattering, but it is real. The next time they meet, his smile is smaller, less performative. He's softer, not because she asked him to be, because the act is getting harder to keep up. Her mystery has begun to pull the real man out from behind the armor. He's confused by her calm, knows how she can be warm without being available, tender without being touched. There's something terrifyingly holy about a woman who knows she is not here to save you, only to reflect what you must save yourself. She doesn't play games, but she doesn't offer clarity either, because that would betray the entire point. He must come to his own understanding. Jung believed that the shadow must be integrated for a man to become whole. And this woman, she is the gate. She is the ache. She is the question that refuses to answer itself. And so the wound grows, but not in pain. It grows in meaning. He begins to see how deeply he projected his longings onto her. She hadn't made promises, she hadn't offered a fantasy. She was simply present, and her presence demanded that he show up too. Not with charm or cleverness, but with honesty. With rawness. With the kind of courage that says, I've never done this before, but I'm here anyway. That's the power of the feminine mystery. It doesn't seduce with skin, it seduces with depth. And when a man finally understands that her silence isn't emptiness, its sacred space, he either walks away forever or falls in a way he can never undo. This part of the story is where the wound becomes magnetic. Not because she tries to keep him, but because she never needed to. Her mystery doesn't pull him in with force. It pulls him in with reflection. And that, in the language of Jung, is what every man secretly seeks, not a woman to complete him, but a woman to remind him who he could become. There's a moment. Not always loud, not always visible, when a man begins to realize that she's not chasing him. She's not explaining, not correcting, not clinging. She is simply being. Her mystery, once mistaken for passivity, becomes the very source of gravity that pulls him into orbit. This is not the kind of woman who begs for attention. She becomes the mirror he can't stop looking into, not because she reflects him, but because she reflects what he's missing. And when that realization dawns, it doesn't feel like longing. It feels like obsession cloaked in silence. Carl Jung believed that we are magnetically drawn to that which is unresolved within ourselves. She, in her stillness, her unspoken depth, her refusal to explain, she becomes the living image of everything unresolved in him. Not a woman to conquer, but a wound to understand. Her absence is never just her walking away. It's the haunting space she leaves behind where all his unfinished selves gather. Most men are taught to pursue what they can name, possess, or protect. But she defies all of it. She isn't angry when he leaves. She doesn't retaliate when he pulls away. Instead, she becomes quieter, more elegant. And in that quiet, something inside him panics, not because she's gone, but because her detachment forces him to meet his own emptiness. Every time he tries to replace her, he ends up with noise. Louder laughter, shallower conversations, predictable bodies that do not echo the same depth. She's not a fantasy, and that's what makes her unforgettable. She never played the game. She simply lived in her essence. That feminine essence wasn't seductive in the conventional way. It was spiritual, a kind of pull that didn't ask, didn't need. And for the man who is still running from himself, it was maddening. She loved him without clinging. She saw him without saving. She wanted him without owning. And that was unbearable for a man who only knew love through control. The feminine mystery, according to Jung, is not a trick of femininity. It is the embodiment of the anima, the unconscious feminine within the male psyche. When a woman lives in alignment with that energy, she becomes not just attractive, but transformative. She challenges the man not by confronting him, but by being the archetype his soul longs for, yet resists. And so begins the push and pull. He retreats, she releases. He returns, she receives, but never the same way twice. Every re-entry into her orbit feels different, deeper, more disorienting. And yet, there's a strange safety in her energy. She doesn't offer guarantees, but she offers presence. She doesn't say forever, but she offers now. And that now is so rich, so alive, so whole, it terrifies him. Because to accept her presence fully, he must leave behind the boy who measured worth through attention and step into the man who recognizes power through presence. He tries to label her. He calls her complicated, emotional, confusing. But what he really means is, she makes me feel things I can't control. And the moment he accepts that, even subconsciously, the transformation begins. Her mystery is not just something he desires, it's something that heals. The wound she touches is not the wound of heartbreak, but the deeper, hidden wound of a man disconnected from the sacred feminine in others and in himself. And here lies the paradox. The more he runs, the deeper her impression becomes. He thinks he needs answers, but what he really needs is to sit in the discomfort of not knowing, to stay, to feel, to not fix. And she, without saying a word, teaches him that. Her silence is not absence. It is initiation. It is the altar before which his ego must kneel if love is ever to become real. So he returns, not always physically, but energetically. Late-night thoughts, quiet mornings filled with regret, songs that remind him of the softness he once mocked. She lives in the corners of his mind, not because she chased him there, but because she never tried to enter at all. He invited her in. With every deflection, every rejection, every moment he tried to prove he didn't need her. She unknowingly became the wound that wouldn't close, not because she hurt him, but because she mirrored the hurt he refused to feel. And this is the wound that pulls him in, again and again. Not to suffer, but to transform us. The secret no one tells him. The woman who haunts you isn't a ghost. She's a guide, and the mystery that breaks your heart. It's the door to your own healing. Asterisk, she didn't move the way others did. Her steps were deliberate, not rushed. Like each movement was a conversation with the world. She was a woman wrapped in stillness, not because she lacked expression, but because her silence said more than most words could. And that silence, unexplained, unexplored, undemanding, was the siren's song that pulled him into himself. He began to study her, not to possess her, but to understand how someone could exist so peacefully in a world of need. She didn't chase connection. She simply radiated presence, and that alone created gravitational pull. But he, raised on conquest, validation, and performance, struggled. But he thought if he could decode her, he could own the same power. What he didn't realize was that the feminine mystery wasn't a puzzle to solve, it was a mirror to see yourself. Through the closer he came, the more he realized he was unraveling. Her absence of explanation made him confront his addiction to control. quiet eye contact brought forward every emotion he had buried. Her emotional composure wasn't cold, was deeply felt, but masterfully held. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She didn't need to compete to be chosen. She had already chosen herself. And it was that self-containment, so rare in a world of emotional leaking, that stirred his buried longing to feel whole. But instead of rising to meet her, he projected. He called her distant. He called her confusing. He even accused her of manipulation, because his ego couldn't accept that someone could possess so much inner clarity without trying to dominate. And this is where Jung's shadow theory came alive. What he could not own in himself, he demonized in her. He began to oscillate between awe and irritation. One moment she was a goddess to him, the next a threat. When she did not react to his provocations, he upped them. He flirted with other women in front of her, not to find connection, but to awaken jealousy. But she only smiled, like a mother watching a child test boundaries. That smile wounded him more than rejection ever could, because it meant she saw through him completely, and yet she didn't move. She didn't need to. And in her immovability, he felt the weight of every woman he had abandoned, every emotion he had ignored, every wound he had denied. She was not the cause of his unraveling. She was the permission slip for his soul to finally feel it. Men often think the feminine mystery is about seduction, about beauty, about playing hard to get. But true feminine mystery isn't about withholding. It's about being so deeply rooted in self-respect, in intuitive knowing, in sacred detachment, that you don't entertain anything that requires performance. And in her, he saw this for the first time. She didn't chase closure. She didn't need to explain her standards. She simply embodied them. And the more she lived in that embodiment, the more he realized he had never truly met a woman before. Only roles, only reactions, only mirrors to his own performance. But she was different. She mirrored his emptiness, not by exposing it, but by refusing to fill it for him. The magnetic wound wasn't in her, was in him. She only revealed it. The wound of not being nurtured emotionally. The wound of always needing to prove his worth. The wound of not knowing what to do when someone doesn't react. She became the flame, not because she tried to, but because she burned away everything false in his presence. And every time he looked at her, he didn't just see a woman. He saw a doorway into himself, into his unmet grief, into his mother. Wounds, his shame, his need for control. She awakened the ache he had buried under logic, under games, under success. And once it was awake, there was no putting it back to sleep. He told himself he had walked away, that it was his choice, that he didn't need her stillness, her eyes that saw too much, her calm that unraveled his defenses. But when night fell and distractions faded, her presence haunted him, not like a ghost, but like a mirror he had smashed too quickly, only to later realize he needed it to see himself. She hadn't chased him. She hadn't begged or pleaded. She simply let him leave with the same grace she let him enter. That, too, confused him, because he had learned power was in possession. And now, for the first time, he realized the deepest. Power was in non-attachment. She wasn't trying to be mysterious. She was just being herself. And that threatened every layer of him that had been built on performance. There's a quiet violence to self-respect, especially when it comes from a woman. It does not scream, it does not warn. It does not demand an audience. But it leaves men trembling because it forces them to ask, "Who am I if I am not needed?" She had no need to be needed. And that was the deepest cut. He was used to women, molding themselves to soothe his wounds. But she did not bend. She didn't lecture or correct him either. She simply stayed true to herself. And it was that integrity so unshaken, so constant, that made him realize he had mistaken control for love and attention for affection. The pain wasn't that she withheld anything from him. The pain was that she never offered illusions. She only offered truth, and he wasn't ready for it. He began to remember the small things. How she didn't speak much in groups, yet, when she did, people stopped to listen. How she didn't flatter, didn't charm yet, made people feel seen. How her presence felt like a place more than a performance. He hadn't understood it at the time. He thought love was noise, grand gestures, loud confessions, promises written in drama. But now, in the silence of her absence, he began to understand that mystery wasn't about what she hid, it was about what he couldn't yet comprehend. Her power wasn't manipulation, it was clarity. It was the rare, terrifying clarity of a woman who needed nothing from a man but truth. And that was something he had never learned how to give. Carl Jung once said that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. And in her, he met his fate. She was the embodiment of everything he had ignored in himself, the longing to feel, to surrender, to be real. But he didn't know how to stand naked in the emotional sense, so he armored up. He distanced. He criticized. He blamed. Because that was easier than saying, "You make me feel things I've never allowed myself to feel." She had never hurt him, but he hurt himself trying to resist what she reflected. In truth, he wasn't scared of losing her. He was scared that if he let her in, he'd have to meet himself and find out how much of him was a mask. Men aren't taught to revere the feminine. They're taught to consume it, to label it, to understand it so they can control it. But she didn't fit any label. She was soft and fierce, warm and distant, kind yet boundaried. She didn't give herself away. She chose. And when she chose him, it wasn't out of need, was out of conscious invitation. But he didn't know how to receive something that didn't come with chaos. So he created chaos because that was familiar. That was home. And when she didn't play into it, when she simply stepped back with grace and refused to explain herself, he realized she wasn't confusing. He was just unprepared. She wasn't mysterious. He was just not ready to understand a woman who'd already done the inner work he was too afraid to begin. Asterisk, she never said goodbye. She didn't need to. The way she left wasn't an exit, was an unveiling. Like the moon slipping behind a cloud, her absence didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like invitation, a sacred silence, a question he now carried in his chest like a prayer. What was I running from, really? And the deeper he sat with it, the more he saw that she hadn't wounded him. She had revealed the wound that had been there all along. The wound that kept him chasing chaos. The wound that mistook intensity for intimacy. The wound that confused being needed with being known. She didn't heal him. She didn't try to. But she mirrored what healing might look like if he was ever brave enough to begin. And that was the thing. Her power had never been in the way she loved him. It was in the way she loved herself. That silent, grounded kind of love. The kind that didn't ask for validation, didn't shrink to be chosen, didn't explain her boundaries like apologies. And as the days turned to seasons, and he looked back, he stopped asking why she was the way she was and began asking why he wasn't. Why he had been so afraid of depth. Why he had avoided softness. Why he had laughed at spiritual things until he needed them. Why he kept seeking women who would crack open for him, instead of choosing the one who refused to collapse, even when it would have been easier. She had held her mystery like a candle, not a weapon. And it lit the parts of him he had buried in shadow. Some nights he still dreams of her, but not in a desperate way. Not in the "I miss you" kind of way. It's quieter than that. Like a song that once meant nothing until life broke him just enough to understand the lyrics. He doesn't reach out. He never did. And maybe he never will. Because now he knows. You don't reach for someone like her unless you're ready to offer what she already gave herself. wholeness. And back then, he wasn't whole. He was a maze of performances, a collage of what others expected. A man too used to taking and too unpracticed in receiving without conquering. But now he's learning. Not to get her back, but to become someone who would never need to. Hurt a woman like that to feel strong? In the end, the mystery she carried wasn't about being unreadable. It was about being untouchable by those who didn't approach her with reverence. She didn't pull him in with seduction. She pulled him in with presence, with peace. And that's what scared him most, because it asked him to put down his weapons, to stop performing, to be real. And now he sees it. The magnetic wound wasn't something she caused. It was something she revealed. She had been a moment in his life, yes, but a moment so full of truth that it expanded into a lifetime of becoming. She was never a destination. She was a door, and through that door, he finally stepped, not to chase her, but to meet himself.